Have you ever been told without words, but with a look that you didn't belong somewhere, even when you had every right to be there? Imagine walking onto a plane, holding a valid ticket for first class, only to be stopped, not because of a mistake, not because of security, but because of the color of your skin. That was the reality for Dr. Malcolm Wright, one of the most respected black CEOs in America. In that moment, he faced a choice: stay silent and swallow the humiliation, or stand firm and risk everything. What would you have done if it were you, your daughter, or someone you love? Would you step aside to keep the peace? Or would you say, enough? This story isn't just about one man and one flight. It's about dignity, courage, and the quiet strength it takes to change the course of an entire industry with a single decision. Stay with us, because what happened next will make you rethink what it means to belong. If this message touches you, please like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel so more people can hear stories that truly matter. The morning light over Los Angeles shimmered with that peculiar mix of golden haze and restless energy. Travelers hurried along the polished corridors of LAX, rolling bags clattering like a chorus of tiny drums. The smell of coffee drifted from a kiosk, mingling with the faint scent of jet fuel carried in from the tarmac. It was, by all appearances, an ordinary day. Yet for one man, this day would etch itself in memory like no other. Dr. Malcolm Wright stood near Gate 72, quietly adjusting the strap of his leather carry-on. At 47, he carried himself with a mix of calm confidence and deliberate humility. His salt and pepper hair was closely cropped, his navy blazer neat but unpretentious. Nothing about his appearance shouted power, but anyone who lingered long enough on his face would see the steadiness in his eyes, the kind of steadiness forged through storms survived rather than avoided. Malcolm was no ordinary traveler. He was the founder and CEO of Wright Aerospace, a company that had become a global leader in avionics design. His work powered fleets of commercial aircraft and advanced navigation systems used by the U.S. Air Force. Forbes had once named him one of the 50 minds who move the future. Yet here, in the swirl of a bustling airport, he looked like just another businessman waiting for a flight. That was the way Malcolm preferred it. Fame, he believed, was a distraction. What mattered was the mission, and today's mission was deeply personal. He was flying to Washington, D.C., to deliver the keynote address at the National Forum on Aviation Equity, a gathering meant to address the stubborn shadows of bias that still haunted the skies. The irony was not lost on him. For decades, he had dreamed of speaking from such a platform, sharing his journey from a working-class neighborhood in Atlanta to the highest reaches of aerospace innovation. He wanted to tell the young dreamers that the sky was theirs too, no matter what others whispered. Still, as he stood among the lines of travelers, he felt the old, familiar tension, the subtle tightening in his chest, the quiet voice of caution he had lived with since childhood. Be careful. Don't give them an excuse. Even now, even here, you are never just a man. You are always a black man first in their eyes. He took a breath, steadying himself, and shifted his gaze to the wide windows. Outside, a gleaming aircraft waited at the gate, its silver body glinting in the morning sun. Seat 2A awaited him in the first-class cabin. He had chosen it deliberately, both for comfort and for the symbolism. It was a small, private act of defiance against every closed door he had ever faced. The scholarship once denied him, the promotion withheld, the conference where he had been mistaken for the valet. Seat 2A was his. He had earned it, paid for it, claimed it, Around him, the boarding process began. Families clustered together, parents juggling strollers and juice boxes. A group of suited men in their 30s joked loudly, clutching briefcases and half-finished lattes. An elderly woman with a kind face and silver hair, later he would learn her name. Eleanor Grant watched the commotion with quiet amusement. She caught Malcolm's eye, and for a moment they shared a simple nod. Strangers acknowledging the shared ritual of travel. Boarding Group 1. "Now welcome aboard," the agent called cheerfully. The loudspeaker crackled, and a wave of passengers pressed forward. Malcolm joined them, pulling his carry-on behind him. The line moved at its usual rhythm stop. Shuffle. Show your phone. Smile. Pass through. His phone displayed the electronic boarding pass clearly. Flight 218 LAX to DCA, first class, Site 20. Yet as he stepped closer to the podium, that old tension coiled a little tighter inside him. He had learned to listen to it, because too many times it had been right. He remembered being 10 years old, standing in line at a grocery store with his mother. A clerk had pulled them aside, demanded to search their bags because something looked off. They had found nothing, of course, but the humiliation of standing there, eyes burning under the stares of strangers, had settled deep in his bones. He remembered being 30, waiting for a meeting at a corporate office. A security guard had asked him brusquely whose car he was waiting to bring around. He had laughed it off then, but the memory lingered, now. As he stepped forward at Gate 72, he wondered not for the first time how many more indignities life still held in store, no matter how far he had risen. Malcolm shook off the thought. Stay calm. Get on the plane. Focus on your speech. Today is about the future, not the past. He reached the agent, smiled politely, and scanned his phone over the reader. The green light flashed, a crisp beep confirming his passage. The agent nodded. Thank you. Dr. Wright. Have a good flight. And for a moment, it seemed everything would be ordinary. He walked down the jet bridge, the cool air humming with the vibration of ventilation fans. His shoes clicked softly against the floor. Ahead, the cabin door stood open, the faint scent of coffee and disinfectant drifting out. A flight attendant greeted passengers with rehearsed cheer. Malcolm straightened his blazer, preparing to step into the calm sanctuary of first class. He thought about the notes in his briefcase, the words he would soon deliver in Washington, words about dignity, fairness, and the belief that every person had a place in the sky. He had no idea that within minutes, those very words would be tested in a way he could never have imagined. The hum of the jet bridge lingered in Malcolm's ears, but his mind drifted backward, carried by memory more than sound. Journeys were like that for him. Airports, no matter how modern or polished, had a way of pressing on old scars. They reminded him of departures and returns, of promises made and broken, of the endless cycle of proving himself again and again. He had grown up in Atlanta, the son of a postal worker and a nurse's aide. Their modest house stood on a street where sidewalks cracked under the roots of old oaks, where children played basketball under flickering streetlights, and where every neighbor seemed to know one another's business. It was a place of warmth, but also of warnings. His mother's voice still echoed in him. Malcolm, you got to be twice as good to get half as far. Never forget that. He had never forgotten. At 12, he entered a math competition and placed first in the entire state. His joy had lasted exactly 3 days until a teacher told him he must have cheated. The accusation was baseless, yet it stripped him of the easy pride that other children carried so effortlessly. He learned then that brilliance would never shield him from suspicion. At 18, he earned admission to MIT, a dream he had clung to like a lifeline. But the scholarship committee had run out of funds, as they phrased it. He remembered walking out of that office, heart pounding, the acceptance letter trembling in his hand. He worked 2 jobs, washed dishes at night, fixed air conditioners on weekends, anything to scrape together tuition. Every dollar carried the weight of defiance. By 25, he had founded Wright Aerospace in a rented garage. At 35, contracts with the Air Force made headlines. At 45, Forbes called him one of the most influential figures in global aviation. And yet here, at 47, standing in a jet bridge, he still carried the same quiet dread that at any moment someone might question whether he belonged. Malcolm knew the irony of his own journey. He was on his way to deliver a keynote about dismantling prejudice in the skies. He had written those words carefully, pouring into them every lesson learned from decades of resilience. He wanted to talk about young people of color entering STEM fields, about creating safety in the air not just mechanically, but socially. He wanted to remind the industry that dignity was not optional. It was essential. Still, beneath the polished sentences in his briefcase, his heart carried another speech, the speech he had never said aloud. The one that whispered at night when sleep was slow to come. You can build empires. You can save billions of dollars. You can launch satellites. But to them, you will always be a question mark. That voice gnawed at him even now, as he inched toward the cabin door. The flight attendant waiting at the threshold smiled with a warmth that seemed genuine. "Welcome aboard, sir," she said, gesturing toward first class. Malcolm gave a polite nod, stepping inside. The cabin smelled faintly of leather and brewed coffee. Passengers already settled in looked up briefly before returning to newspapers and glowing screens. For a fleeting moment, peace seemed possible. Seat 2A was only steps away. He imagined sliding into it, fastening the belt, opening his folder, and preparing to refine the cadence of his keynote. The hum of the engines would soon lull him into calm focus. But even as he pictured it, doubt pricked at him again. He remembered an incident 3 years earlier on a different airline. A gate agent had eyed his boarding pass skeptically, asking for extra ID verification. "We've had a lot of fraud lately," she had said. Other first-class passengers had sailed through with a casual wave of their phones. He had complied without argument. But the sting lingered. His friend, a fellow CEO, once told him, "Malcolm, you overthink these things. Just enjoy your success." But Malcolm knew better. Success did not erase suspicion. Sometimes it magnified it. He had built a company worth billions, yet suspicion seemed to shadow him like an unshakable companion. Sliding his bag into the overhead bin, he sat down in 2A. The seat embraced him with its plush leather, but the comfort felt fragile. He adjusted the belt, exhaled slowly, and closed his eyes. He thought of his daughter, Jasmine, 19 years old and now a sophomore at Harvard. She had inherited his sharp mind and her grandmother's unyielding spirit. Only last week, she had called him after an unpleasant encounter at a student conference. A security guard had mistaken her for staff, asking her to clear away used cups. She had laughed it off, but Malcolm had heard the crack in her voice. He remembered whispering into the phone, "Baby girl, you don't owe anyone proof of who you are. But when you face it, and you will remember you are carrying more than just yourself. You are carrying generations who never got the chance. Now, As he sat in 2A, those words echoed back to him. Carry it well. Malcolm, carry it with grace. He glanced out the window. The morning sun had risen higher, casting long beams across the runway. Ground crew in neon vests moved briskly around the aircraft, guiding baggage carts, checking tires, signaling with wands. Everything looked so ordinary, and yet, he knew from experience, ordinary could fracture in a second. His watch buzzed softly. A calendar reminder glowed. Keynote rehearsal 7 p.m. Washington. He tapped it away, leaning back into the headrest. He wanted to believe that this flight would be uneventful. Just hours in the sky. Nothing more. But deep in his chest, that old tension coiled again. He could almost hear his mother's warning, spoken decades earlier in their small Atlanta kitchen. The higher you rise, son, the more some will try to pull you back down. Don't let them. Don't ever let them. He whispered to himself so softly no one could hear. I won't, Mama. Not today. Not ever. He didn't know that within minutes, his resolve would be tested in front of hundreds of strangers and millions more who would soon watch from their screens. The hum of the engines outside grew stronger as passengers continued to file into the aircraft. From his seat in 2A, Dr. Malcolm Wright watched the small parade of humanity shuffle down the aisle. Each face carried its own story, the mother coaxing her toddler with crackers, the businessman muttering into his Bluetooth earpiece, the college students with backpacks plastered in stickers from places they had already conquered. The first-class cabin remained a sanctuary of calm, at least for the moment. Leather seats gleamed under the soft light. Flight attendants moved briskly, adjusting overhead bins, offering to hang jackets. A soft announcement echoed through the cabin. We'll be boarding all passengers shortly. Please keep the aisles clear. Malcolm sat back, adjusting his briefcase at his feet. He glanced again at the notes for his keynote. Words about equality, about dignity, about fairness. He wanted to believe those words had weight, but even now, sitting in the comfort of 2A, he could not fully silence the caution inside him. A rustle in the aisle caught his attention. Mrs. Eleanor Grant, the elderly woman he had noticed earlier at the gate, was making her way forward. She moved carefully, cane in one hand, small handbag in the other. A younger flight attendant stepped forward to help her. Malcolm watched her settle into 2C, right beside him. Well, she said softly, adjusting her seatbelt with a faint smile. Looks like I have good company for this flight. Malcolm returned the smile. It does seem so. Her eyes twinkled. Don't mind me if I nod off halfway to Washington. These flights tire me more than they used to. I don't mind at all, Malcolm said, his voice warm. Safe travels are all that matter. It was a small exchange, but it grounded him, the ordinariness of it. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe this flight would remain just that ordinary. But the rhythm of travel has a way of shifting suddenly, like clear skies breaking into storm without warning. The boarding slowed, and then a pause fell over the cabin. It was the kind of pause that made people look up from their phones. Malcolm noticed the flight attendants exchanging glances. Then he saw him. Captain Douglas Shaw stepped into the cabin. At 60, Shaw's frame was still broad, his posture commanding. His uniform was pressed sharply, stripes gleaming on his shoulders. He had the air of a man accustomed to control, a man who believed the authority of the cockpit extended far beyond its doors. His eyes swept the cabin, assessing passengers not as individuals, but as variables in his command. Malcolm had met dozens of pilots over the years. Most were courteous professionals who carried the weight of their duty with quiet pride. Shaw's presence, however, radiated something different, a sternness that seemed sharper than necessary. The captain's gaze locked briefly on Malcolm in 2A. It lingered. Too long. Malcolm felt it. The old unease stirred again. He sat straighter, holding Shaw's stare with calm, refusing to flinch. Shaw broke the silence with a nod to the lead flight attendant, then turned down the aisle toward the cockpit. Yet the way his eyes had lingered made Malcolm's chest tighten. "Beside him," Eleanor Grant whispered. "That one looks like he eats nails for breakfast." Malcolm chuckled softly, though the tension in his shoulders did not ease. "Let's hope he's better at flying than glaring." Eleanor gave a knowing hum. Some men carry storms with them wherever they go. The boarding resumed. More passengers filtered in, economy filling seat by seat. Malcolm leaned back, trying to steady himself. Perhaps he was overthinking. Perhaps Shaw's stare meant nothing. Still, the unease refused to leave. 15 minutes later, the cabin grew full. The overhead bins shut with final clicks. Flight attendants moved through their routines, securing bags, checking seat belts. A calm voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please find your seats. We'll be departing shortly." Malcolm exhaled, thinking perhaps the tension had been nothing more than nerves. He reached for the glass of water offered by the attendant. Then came the disruption. From the rear of the plane, a voice rose. At first, it was muffled by distance. Then it grew sharper, cutting through the cabin. A supervisor had entered the plane, accompanied by none other than Captain Shaw. They stopped in the aisle near row 10, speaking in low tones. The supervisor looked uneasy, shifting his weight. Shaw's voice, though quieter than a shout, carried the unmistakable edge of authority. Malcolm felt Eleanor's hand brush lightly against his sleeve. She whispered, "He keeps looking this way." Sure enough. Shaw's eyes cut through the cabin again, resting squarely on Malcolm. This time, the expression was not just stern, it was accusatory, as though he had already drawn a conclusion without a single word exchanged. Passengers nearby began to murmur, sensing tension without knowing its source. The atmosphere shifted, like air heavy before a storm. Inside, Malcolm's mind spun with memories. The grocery store, the scholarship office, the security guard mistaking him for a chauffeur. And now, here, in 2A, each memory pressed down like layers of weight. He closed his eyes briefly, whispering inwardly, "Stay calm. You are not 12 years old anymore. You are not powerless, but you must not give them reason." When he opened his eyes, Shaw was walking down the aisle, his heavy steps deliberate. The supervisor followed, reluctant. Passengers leaned aside to make room, curiosity flickering in their faces. Shaw stopped at row 2, right beside 2A. Malcolm felt every eye in the cabin turn toward him. The captain's voice came low, edged with steel. "Sir, I need to speak with you about this seat." The words hung there, slicing through the hum of the engines. Eleanor inhaled sharply. Malcolm did not move. He met Shaw's stare, calm but unyielding. "This is my seat," Malcolm said evenly. He held up his boarding pass, the digital glow clear on his phone. "Seat 2A, paid in full." Shaw's jaw tightened. His gaze did not fall to the boarding pass. Instead, it remained locked on Malcolm, hard, scrutinizing. The cabin grew quieter still. Passengers leaned forward, drawn by the weight of the moment. A story was unfolding before their eyes, though they did not yet know its scale. Inside, Malcolm felt the old warning siren blaring. Here it is again. The test. the question mark on your humanity. What will you do now? He breathed deeply, his voice steady but firm. Captain, I belong here. And with those words, the storm truly began to gather. The air in the cabin grew heavy, as if everyone inside had taken a single collective breath and forgotten how to exhale. Captain Douglas Shaw stood squarely in the aisle, towering over row 2. His polished shoes anchored him like a man who had no intention of moving. The narrow passage suddenly felt smaller, the walls of the aircraft closing in. Dr. Malcolm Wright remained seated in 2A. His phone still displayed the glowing boarding pass, the digital letters and numbers spelling out the truth. Yet Shaw did not even glance at it. His focus was fixed on Malcolm himself, as though the facts of paper and pixels carried less weight than the prejudice already cemented in his mind. Sir, Shaw repeated, voice taut, this seat is not yours. A murmur rippled through the nearby rows. Passengers shifted, eyes darting between Malcolm and the captain. Some looked confused, others uncomfortable, a few openly intrigued by the spectacle. Eleanor Grant, seated in 2C, placed her hand lightly on her cane, her lips pressed together, thin and tight, as though bracing for something she had seen before. Malcolm inhaled slowly, forcing calm into his voice. Captain, with respect, it is my seat. Seat 2A. My ticket is here. My name is Malcolm Wright. Shaw's jaw flexed. His words came clipped. I've flown for 30 years. I know when something doesn't add up. And this doesn't add up. The supervisor beside him shifted nervously, lowering his voice. Captain, perhaps we should verify. Shaw cut him off with a glare sharp enough to silence. No, this is my aircraft, and my call. The lead flight attendant hovered nearby, caught between authority and hesitation. Passengers leaned into the tension, phones discreetly angled, some recording. The hum of engines beneath the floor seemed louder now, the steady thrum underscoring every heartbeat. Malcolm held Shaw's gaze. He would not allow himself to look away. Inside. However, the conflict churned. Memories of every time he had been doubted, questioned, diminished pressed against him. His instinct urged restraint, the lifelong lesson drilled into him. Don't give them a reason. Don't let them twist your anger into their justification. But he also knew silence had its cost. Too many times. Silence had been mistaken for acceptance. I am not leaving this seat, Malcolm said finally, his tone low but resolute. I paid for it. I earned it, and I have every right to be here. Shaw's face hardened, the flush rising to his cheeks. Then you are refusing crew instructions. That makes you a non-compliant passenger, which means removal. The words dropped like stones into the cabin. A few gasps sounded. Eleanor's hand tightened around her cane, knuckles white. She whispered under her breath, Lord have mercy. The supervisor took a step closer, his voice almost pleading. Captain, maybe we can handle this another way. Shaw ignored him. He leaned closer to Malcolm, his voice sharp, cutting the space between them. Stand up, now, or you will be escorted off this plane. Malcolm felt the weight of dozens of eyes on him, some sympathetic, some curious, some indifferent. He thought of Jasmine, his daughter, thought of the advice he had given her. You don't owe anyone proof of who you are. Yet here he was, forced once again to prove himself, cornered by authority in front of strangers. His heart pounded, but his face remained calm. Captain Shaw, I will not surrender my dignity to your suspicion. The stillness after his words felt electric. The air thickened, heavy with the charge of confrontation. Then, as if on cue, Someone in the back whispered, "Just loud enough to carry." "What's he even doing up here anyway?" Another voice, firmer, answered, "He belongs. Leave the man alone." The divide among passengers began to show. Shaw's eyes narrowed. He straightened, turning toward the flight attendants. "Call security to the gate. We're not taking off until this matter is resolved." The lead attendant hesitated, glancing at Malcolm, then at Eleanor, then back to the captain. Her lips parted as if to speak, but the authority of Shaw's command pulled her into silence. She lifted the phone to her ear, murmuring into it. Malcolm sat motionless, his boarding pass still visible. The absurdity of the moment struck him that facts lay in his hand, undeniable, yet prejudice held the power. His pulse thundered, but outwardly he exuded composure, every gesture deliberate, controlled. Eleanor leaned closer, her voice a whisper meant only for him. "You hold your ground, son. Don't let him break you." He gave the slightest nod. "I won't." The cabin door opened again. 2 security officers appeared, their presence stirring fresh murmurs among the passengers. One was tall, built broad, his expression unreadable. The other looked younger, uncertain, scanning the scene with darting eyes. Shaw wasted no time. He gestured sharply toward Malcolm. "This man is refusing to comply with my instructions. He needs to be removed immediately." The younger officer frowned. "Sir, what's the issue exactly? Does he not have a boarding pass?" Shaw's voice cracked like a whip. "He doesn't belong in this seat. That's the issue. I'm the captain. I've made the call." The older officer hesitated, then turned to Malcolm. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" Finally, someone asked the question that should have been asked from the start. Malcolm handed over his phone, the boarding pass glowing brightly. The officer scanned it, checked the seat number, the name, the date. He glanced back at Shaw. "Everything checks out. Seat 2A is his." A murmur of agreement swept through the nearby passengers. Phones tilted higher, recording the exchange, but Shaw's face reddened, anger flickering in his eyes. "I said he's non-compliant. He questioned my authority. That's enough." The officer shifted uncomfortably. The younger one looked even more uncertain, clearly caught between deference to the captain and the facts in his hand. Malcolm sat tall, his voice steady though his chest burned. "Officers, I am not refusing safety instructions. I am simply refusing to surrender my rightful seat to prejudice." The older officer exhaled slowly, as though carrying the weight of a decision. "We need to sort this out properly. Removing him doesn't seem justified." Shaw's glare could have cut steel. "You undermine me. You undermine this entire crew. If he stays, I will not fly this plane." Gas echoed. The threat was unmistakable. Passengers shifted restlessly, whispers growing louder. Some voices rose in protest. "This isn't right." He showed the pass. Others stayed silent, avoiding involvement. Malcolm closed his eyes briefly, breathing deeply. Inside, his mother's words rose once more. "The higher you rise, the harder they'll try to pull you down. Don't let them." He opened his eyes, meeting the gaze of every officer, every passenger, and finally Shaw himself. "This," Malcolm said quietly, but with a strength that filled the cabin, "is not about compliance. It is about dignity." And in that moment, though the storm raged around him, he stood his ground not with fists or fury, but with unshakable presence. The confrontation had reached its peak, yet the battle was only beginning. The tension in the cabin had thickened into something nearly physical. Every breath seemed heavier, every sound sharper. The hum of the aircraft systems, once a background lull, now roared in everyone's ears. Passengers leaned across aisles, craning their necks to catch every word. Phones glowed in discreet hands, the little red dots of recording apps quietly blinking. Captain Douglas Shaw stood rigid in the aisle, his shoulders squared like a man who believed his authority was absolute. His face flushed deep red, veins visible along his temples. He turned toward the security officers again, his voice hard enough to slice through the air. "I gave a lawful instruction. He refused. That's all you need to know. Remove him. Now." The older officer, Officer Harris, shifted, his jaw tight. "Captain, with respect, the boarding pass is valid. We can't just." Shaw jabbed a finger toward him, fury flashing in his eyes. "Don't you lecture me about procedure. This is my aircraft, my command. If I say he goes, he goes." A ripple of unease traveled through the passengers. Some whispered indignantly. Others sat frozen, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. A woman in row 3 muttered, "This is ridiculous," while a man across the aisle whispered back, "Just let the pilot do his job." The divide widened, silence punctured by fragments of debate. Dr. Malcolm Wright sat motionless, his back straight, his phone still glowing with proof, outwardly calm, but inside a storm raged. His mind replayed every instance of being underestimated, every door closed in his face, every time someone assumed his presence was a mistake. The humiliation pressed against him like a weight, but beneath it was a current of resolve stronger than steel. He thought of Jasmine again, her laughter, her boundless questions, her belief that her father could solve anything. What would she think if she saw him shrink? Now no, he would not yield. Malcolm spoke with deliberate steadiness. "Captain Shaw, I respect the responsibility you carry, but respect is not the same as submission. My name is Malcolm Wright. My seat is 2A, and I will not be erased because of your prejudice." A hush fell. The words landed heavy, undeniable. Eleanor Grant's cane tapped lightly against the floor as she straightened in her seat. "He's right," she declared, her voice brittle but firm. "I saw his pass myself. He belongs here. You're humiliating him, and all of us by extension." Several passengers nodded, emboldened. A young man in row 4 raised his phone higher. "Yeah, we're all seeing this. It's wrong." Shaw's glare darted around, settling back on Malcolm. "You people think you can challenge me in my own cabin." The phrase "you people" hung in the air like smoke from a fire. The atmosphere shifted instantly. A collective intake of breath echoed through the rows. Even those who had remained silent looked up sharply, some in disbelief, others in anger. Malcolm's chest tightened, but his face remained calm. He let the words settle, refusing to be baited into an explosion. "Captain, I won't dignify that remark with anger, but I will not move." The officers exchanged uneasy glances. The younger one, Officer Daniels, spoke hesitantly. "Captain, this doesn't feel right. He has the documents. If we remove him, it could." Shaw snapped. "Enough. If the two of you won't act, then I will." He reached for Malcolm's arm. Gas burst around the cabin. Eleanor half rose, her cane raised. "Don't you dare lay a hand on him before Shaw could make contact." Officer Harris stepped between them, blocking the captain's path. His voice was calm, but firm. "Captain, stand down. You're crossing a line." The passengers erupted into whispers, some clapping quietly in support. Phones captured every angle. The balance of power, once unquestioned, now wavered. Shaw's nostrils flared. "You're undermining my authority. Do you understand the consequences of this?" Harris held his ground. "Do you?" For a moment, no one moved. The hum of the engines, the murmur of voices, the pounding of hearts all fused into a tense silence. Then a new voice cut through the air. Clear, steady, unmistakable. "That's enough." From the rear of the cabin, a man in plain clothes stepped forward. His badge glinted briefly in the cabin lights as he revealed it from under his jacket. The letters were crisp, undeniable: Air Marshal Samuel Ortiz. The reaction was instant. Passengers gasped. Whispers raced like wildfire down the aisle. The presence of an air marshal shifted the dynamic completely. Authority rebalanced itself in a single heartbeat. Ortiz walked slowly toward the confrontation, his movements deliberate, calm, his eyes, dark and unwavering, flicked from Shaw to Malcolm, then to the officers. "I've been observing since boarding. It's clear what's happening here." Shaw stiffened. "This is my aircraft. You have no right to override my command." Ortiz's voice was measured, but ironclad. "I have the right to ensure safety and federal compliance. And right now, the only threat to safety I see is you, Captain." The passengers murmured louder, some clapping openly now. Eleanor whispered a prayer of thanks under her breath. Malcolm exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest loosening, though the weight of the moment was far from over. Shaw sputtered, searching for ground. "You can't do this. You don't understand." Ortiz cut him off. "I understand perfectly. A passenger with a valid ticket has been targeted and humiliated. Federal law is clear. Discrimination will not be tolerated." The older officer, Harris, nodded firmly, agreed. Ortiz turned toward Malcolm, his expression respectful. "Sir, please remain seated. You have every right to be here. No one is removing you." Malcolm inclined his head slightly. Words caught in his throat. Gratitude swelled, tempered by the sting of everything he had endured to reach this moment. Ortiz faced Shaw again. His voice sharpened, leaving no space for doubt. "Captain Shaw, step away from the passenger. Effective immediately. You are relieved of duty pending investigation." The cabin erupted. Gasps, cheers, and claps filled the air. Some passengers cried out in relief, others in outrage, but no one looked away. The twist was undeniable. The man who had wielded power so arrogantly was now stripped of it, publicly, unmistakably. Shaw's face drained of color, his authority dissolving before dozens of watchful eyes. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Ortiz's steady stare allowed none. Malcolm sat still, his heartbeat thundering. The storm had not passed. Consequences would ripple far beyond this flight. But for the first time in the long minutes of confrontation, hope broke through the tension like light-cutting clouds. And though he did not move, every passenger could see it. The man in 2A had not just defended his seat. He had defended dignity itself. The cabin felt like a theater where every seat was taken, every breath suspended. The revelation that Samuel Ortiz was an air marshal had cracked the atmosphere wide open. Power shifted in that instant, and everyone knew it. Captain Douglas Shaw's face was pale, but his jaw remained tight. His pride, the only shield left to him, flared stubbornly. "You don't understand what you're doing," he said, voice shaking. "This is my command, my responsibility. Without me, this aircraft cannot depart." Ortiz's reply was cool, stripped of emotion yet laced with certainty. "Without you, Captain, this aircraft will depart safely, because safety doesn't come from authority alone. It comes from integrity, and right now, integrity is absent in your actions." The silence that followed was profound. Passengers stared, transfixed. A woman in row 5 clasped her hands together as though in prayer. A businessman shook his head slowly, whispering, "Unbelievable. Dr." Malcolm Wright sat very still in 2A. He didn't speak, but inside, emotions clashed like thunder. Relief pulsed through him, relief that someone else, finally, had taken up the fight on his behalf. But beneath that relief was sorrow, too. Why did it always take a public spectacle, a dramatic intervention, for truth to be seen? Why couldn't his word alone have been enough? His mother's old saying returned. They won't believe the tree has fruit until someone else points it out. The ache of that truth pressed against him. Even in victory, Shaw, unable to reclaim control, pointed a trembling finger at Malcolm. "This man is manipulating you. He's turning this into a circus. You're all blind to the danger." Eleanor Grant's cane struck the floor with a sharp crack. "The only danger here, Captain, is your arrogance. I've lived long enough to know what prejudice looks like. You thought you could bully him because of the color of his skin, but the whole world is watching now." The clapping started softly to one pair of hands, then another, then a ripple across the cabin. Passengers, once hesitant, now found courage in Eleanor's words. The sound swelled into a current. Shaw could not dam. Ortiz raised a hand for quiet, his calm authority cutting through the noise. "Captain Shaw, for the safety of this flight, I am ordering you off this aircraft. Officers, please escort him." Harris nodded, though the weight of the moment was visible in his eyes. Daniels looked shaken, as if realizing the enormity of what they were part of. They stepped closer to Shaw, who recoiled, fury twisting his features. "You'll regret this," Shaw hissed. "All of you. I've given 20 years to this airline, and this is how it ends." Ortiz met his glare evenly. "It ends because you chose pride over duty. You humiliated a paying passenger, undermined trust, and violated the very principle you swore to uphold. That is on you." With those words, Shaw's resistance faltered. His shoulders slumped. His breath came ragged, and for the first time, he seemed smaller, diminished. Harris and Daniels guided him gently but firmly down the aisle. Some passengers jeered. Others watched in stunned silence. The sight of a captain being removed was something few would ever forget. As Shaw disappeared into the jet bridge, Ortiz turned to the passengers. His tone softened, carrying the weight of reassurance. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to assure you that your safety has not been compromised. This incident was about dignity, not danger. Another qualified captain will be assigned. Until then, remain seated. You are safe." Applause rippled again, not as chaotic as before, but steadier, like gratitude finding its voice. Malcolm finally exhaled. His hands, which had remained folded in his lap, loosened. He leaned back, his chest rising and falling with the exhaustion of holding himself steady for so long. He felt eyes on him from every direction, some filled with admiration, others with apology, still others with curiosity. Eleanor reached across the aisle, her wrinkled hand brushing his arm gently. "You did right, son. You didn't move, and that matters. They'll remember that." Malcolm gave a small nod, his throat tight. "I didn't want to be a spectacle. I just wanted to sit in my seat." Her eyes softened. Sometimes dignity becomes a spectacle, whether we want it to or not. Ortiz approached, crouching slightly so his voice carried only to Malcolm and Eleanor. "Sir, I know you didn't ask for this, but I need to tell you what you did here matters. You stayed calm. You stood firm. That sends a message more powerful than any speech. Malcolm studied the Air Marshal's face, searching for sincerity. He found it there, quiet, unadorned. He offered a slow nod. "Thank you, Marshal Ortiz. But I'll be honest, I wish my daughter didn't have to see this on the news tonight. She's had enough lessons in how the world sees her." Ortiz's jaw tightened, sympathy flickering across his features. Maybe she'll see something else too, that her father never bowed, never broke. That matters even more. Malcolm looked away, blinking hard. Out the window, the afternoon light glinted off the tarmac, golden and relentless. He thought of Jasmine again, and for the first time since the confrontation began, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this humiliation could be transformed into something greater. The cabin gradually returned to rhythm. Flight attendants whispered into radios, updating the crew. Passengers pulled out water bottles, adjusted seats, shared murmurs of disbelief. Phones kept recording, uploading fragments of the drama to the digital world beyond the cabin walls. Malcolm sat quietly, but inside, reflection churned. He had spent his life building an empire from nothing, proving his worth with contracts, innovations, numbers, but none of those shields had spared him today. It was not the company, the wealth, or the power that held him in 2A. It was sheer resolve, the refusal to surrender his seat, his dignity, his story. He realized, with a clarity that startled him, that this moment was not just his own. It belonged to every traveler who had ever been doubted, to every voice that had been silenced. It was heavy, but also sacred. When the replacement captain finally boarded, greeted by a round of applause, the atmosphere shifted once more. Relief spread, fragile but real. The aircraft would fly, but nothing in that cabin would ever feel quite the same. Malcolm closed his eyes, letting the hum of preparation wash over him. He whispered silently, a promise meant only for himself and for Jasmine. "We'll turn this pain into purpose." For a long while after Captain Shaw was escorted off, the cabin held a kind of heavy silence. It wasn't the silence of peace, but of aftermath, when everyone is still processing what they have just seen. Passengers whispered in fragments, phones were lowered and raised again, and the hum of the engine seemed louder than ever. Malcolm Wright sat back in his seat, staring out at the tarmac. His reflection stared back faintly from the glass, layered over fuel trucks and luggage carts moving below. He saw himself not the CEO featured in magazines, not the man negotiating billion-dollar contracts, but just a weary traveler who had wanted a quiet flight. Eleanor Grant leaned slightly toward him. Her eyes were moist, and she patted his arm gently. "You carried yourself with grace, son. Don't underestimate how much people needed to see that." Malcolm turned to her, voice low. "I didn't want to be seen at all. Not like this. I wanted to come aboard, sit in silence, and work. Instead, now I'm a story." Eleanor's lips curved into a soft, sad smile. "Stories have power. You of all people know that." Her words lingered. Stories had power, yes, but stories also had weight. And now, his name, his presence, might once again be turned into headlines he never asked for. Ortiz returned from the cockpit, now officially in command of the situation until the new captain was briefed. He walked slowly down the aisle, his presence steadying. When he reached Malcolm's seat, he bent down so his words would not carry far. "You all right, Dr. Wright?" Malcolm nodded faintly. "I'm fine. Just tired." Ortiz studied him for a moment, then spoke carefully. You handled yourself with more discipline than most trained officers I've seen. That matters." Malcolm looked away, conflicted. Does it matter enough tomorrow the story will be twisted? Some will say I overreacted. Some will say I played the race card. Others will call it proof that bias is everywhere. And meanwhile, I just wanted to get to Washington in time for a keynote. Ortiz's gaze softened. Maybe your keynote just started early. The words caught Malcolm off guard. He felt them land deep, not as comfort, but as challenge. Was this moment part of a larger speech he hadn't planned to give passengers nearby, leaned in with quiet words of support? A woman in row 3 whispered, "We're with you." A young man across the aisle murmured, "Respect." The solidarity was fragile, yet it warmed the edges of the hurt. Still, Malcolm's inner voice whispered another truth support in the moment often dissolved once the news cycle moved on. He had lived long enough to see it happen again and again. The replacement captain, a composed woman named Karen Lewis, finally entered the cabin. Her presence shifted the air at once. She introduced herself with clarity, apologizing for the disruption, assuring passengers that the flight would continue under safe and respectful conditions. Her tone carried both authority and humility, something Shaw had lacked. As preparations resumed, Malcolm closed his eyes. In the darkness behind his lids, memories surfaced uninvited Jasmine's laughter during their last Sunday dinner, the tremor in her voice when she recounted being mistaken for staff, his own anger at being doubted in a boardroom full of men who had once needed his company more than he needed theirs. The sting of Shaw's words, "You people," replayed sharply. He could feel the burn of humiliation as if it had been carved into him. But alongside it came Eleanor's steady defiance, Ortiz's intervention, and the ripple of clapping from strangers who had found courage because he refused to move. He realized that what happened was no longer just about him. It had become a mirror, forcing everyone in that cabin, and soon, perhaps the whole world, to confront what they believed was acceptable. He whispered almost silently, "What will Jasmine think Eleanor heard him?" Her hearing might have dulled with age, but her instincts were sharp. She'll think her father stood tall, even sitting down. Malcolm opened his eyes, meeting hers. There was truth in her words, a painful truth, yes, but also a liberating one. As the plane taxied, murmurs filled the cabin again. Some passengers spoke of lawsuits, others of headlines. A man behind Malcolm muttered, "That pilot ruined his career." Another whispered, "Good riddance." But Malcolm did not join. He sat in silence, watching the world outside blur past. His fight was not about one man's downfall. It was about dignity itself. Ortiz remained near, vigilant but calm. Malcolm noticed how the marshal's eyes swept the cabin, noting details, ensuring peace. Their gazes met briefly, and Ortiz gave the faintest nod, a wordless recognition of shared understanding. When the plane finally lifted into the sky, a hush fell again. The ground dropped away. Clouds rose to meet them, and for the first time since boarding, Malcolm felt the rhythm of flight steady as breath. Yet the weight within him did not lift. He knew what awaited: headlines, commentary, debates he had not chosen. But perhaps, he thought, this was not a burden to escape, but one to bear. If his pain could spark change, if his seat in 2A could remind the world that respect had no conditions, then maybe it was worth it. He reached for the folder in his briefcase, the one containing the keynote he had prepared. His fingers lingered on the pages, then slowly withdrew. He realized the speech written there no longer fit. Another speech, unplanned, had already begun, written not in ink but in lived experience. He leaned back, let the steady hum of engines surround him, and whispered inwardly, "We'll carry it forward." By the time Flight 227 reached cruising altitude, the story had already left the cabin. It was no longer contained within rows of leather seats and tray tables. It had slipped into glowing screens, uploaded in fragments, shaky videos, hurried captions, raw voices. Passengers had posted clips to social media even before takeoff, and within minutes, those clips spread like wildfire. A 5-second video of Captain Douglas Shaw jabbing a finger toward Malcolm had already gathered thousands of retweets. Another, capturing Eleanor Grant's trembling but fierce declaration, was climbing toward 500,000 views. Hashtags multiplied, Nyasit Hue, Does Dignity in the Air, Pilot Removed. Malcolm didn't see the numbers yet. His phone was on airplane mode, resting silently in his pocket. But around him, murmurs revealed what was happening. "It's already on the news." Someone whispered. "CNN just picked it up." Another leaned toward their neighbor. "My cousin texted, said it's trending." Malcolm exhaled, staring at the small plastic cup of water on his tray. The ripple on the surface seemed to mirror the ripple spreading far beyond the aircraft. He had no control now. His life, his face, his pain were being broadcast into homes, offices, and phones across the country. Eleanor leaned closer. "You'll be everywhere by morning." His lips pressed into a thin line. "That's what I'm afraid of." She tilted her head, studying him with the wisdom of her years. Afraid, yes, but maybe also prepared, because the world needs to see what we saw today. Malcolm let her words sink in. He wanted to believe them, but he also knew the fickle nature of public attention. One day a hero, the next a controversy. Truth twisted, dignity debated, humanity dissected. He had lived long enough to know that public sympathy was rarely permanent. Back on the ground, newsrooms scrambled. A producer in New York shouted across a buzzing floor, "Get me the footage, all of it." Loop the part where the marshal steps in. In Los Angeles, a talk show host rewrote their opening monologue. "Tonight, we discuss the flight that grounded more than a pilot. It grounded prejudice itself." Bloggers typed furiously. Commentators sharpened takes. And in a quiet dorm room at Harvard, Jasmine Wright watched her father's face flicker across her laptop screen. Her breath caught as she recognized the stillness in his expression, the way he refused to flinch even as voices rose around him. Her eyes burned, not with shame, but with a complex mix of pride and ache. She whispered into the empty room, "You did it, Dad. You didn't move." On the plane, Malcolm wrestled with his own storm. He imagined Jasmine watching, imagined colleagues whispering, imagined board members debating whether he had become a liability or a symbol. His life had taught him that power came not only from achievement, but from perception, and perception was now beyond his grasp. Ortiz approached quietly, crouching at Malcolm's row again. His voice was low. "Doc, Wright, I thought you should know. The airline has been informed. They're already issuing statements. By the time we land, executives will be waiting." Malcolm gave a humorless laugh. "Damage control." Ortiz nodded once. "Yes, but maybe more than that. This isn't staying quiet. Not this time." Malcolm closed his eyes, rubbing his temple. "That's the part I can't decide is blessing or curse." Ortiz didn't argue. Instead, he offered a small card from his pocket. "If you need an ally later, call me. I'll stand by what I saw." Malcolm accepted it with a slow nod. "Thank you." Across the aisle, Passengers whispered about lawsuits, apologies, firings. Some were already drafting long social posts, framing themselves as witnesses to history. One man rehearsed in a hushed voice, "I was on that flight. I saw it happen." Malcolm felt the weight of being turned into a symbol. He had spent his life building Wright aerospace, shaping engines and contracts, not narratives. Yet now, unwillingly, he was the centerpiece of a story with momentum beyond his control. He thought of his keynote waiting in Washington. The pages in his folder suddenly felt like relics, words too small for what had unfolded. His real keynote had been written in the cabin of this aircraft, line by line, in the gaze of every witness. The hours in the air passed slowly. Some passengers dozed. Others scrolled endlessly. Still others whispered about the storm outside their metal shell. Malcolm sat quietly, eyes closed, trying to slow his racing thoughts. When the plane finally descended toward deep, the cabin grew restless again. People straightened jackets, packed laptops, craned necks toward windows, yet an undercurrent of tension remained. Everyone knew the moment they stepped off, reality would hit harder. The wheels touched the runway with a soft thud. Applause broke out, the kind born not just from landing, but from surviving something larger than turbulence. Malcolm stayed seated, waiting as the others stood, their chatter rising like a tide. Through the small oval window, he saw flashing cameras beyond the glass. News vans lined the edge of the terminal road. The story had outrun them all. Eleanor touched his arm gently. "Whatever waits out there, remember you held your ground. That can't be undone." He gave her a quiet nod, though his chest tightened. He whispered, half to himself, "Now the real turbulence begins." The cabin door opened with a hiss, and the usual chorus of seatbelts unclicking filled the air. But this time, no one rushed forward. Passengers hesitated, glancing at Malcolm Wright as though aware that stepping past him meant stepping past history itself. He remained seated in 2A, his leather briefcase resting quietly at his feet. He wanted nothing more than to collect his things and leave unnoticed. But the energy pressing against the door told him escape was impossible. Beyond the threshold, voices rose, microphones buzzed, camera flashes flickered against the glass. The story had arrived ahead of him. Ortiz moved down the aisle, stopping at Malcolm's seat. His tone was low, steady. "Dr. Wright, media's swarming outside. The airline's executives, too. You don't have to say anything if you don't want to." Malcolm nodded faintly. Silence has power, but sometimes so does speaking. Eleanor Grant leaned across the aisle, her hand finding his wrist. "Say what your heart tells you, son, not what they expect." Malcolm gave her a grateful nod. The weight of her presence, the quiet strength she had lent him, was a thread holding him steady. The line of passengers finally began to move. Some whispered encouragement as they passed. A young man paused to murmur, "Thank you for not moving." A woman added softly, "My kids will hear about you tonight." Malcolm received their words with a calm face, but inside, unease swelled. He had not chosen to be a lesson. Yet here he was, cast into that role. When it was finally his turn to stand, he rose slowly, straightening his jacket. The briefcase felt heavier than usual in his hand, though he knew its weight hadn't changed. It carried more than papers. Now it carried the weight of what had unfolded in seat 2A. Ortiz guided him toward the door. The moment Malcolm stepped into the jet bridge, the noise surged forward like a wave. Shouted questions overlapped. Flashes burned. Microphones thrust toward him. "Dr. Wright, how do you respond to the pilot's actions? Do you plan to sue the airline? What message do you have for the public tonight?" Executives waited nearby in dark suits, their expressions carefully composed. One man stepped forward. James Parker, the airline's chief operating officer. He extended a hand, his smile strained. "Dr. Wright," Parker said, voice pitched to carry over the noise. "On behalf of the airline, I want to apologize deeply for what you endured today. We're launching a full investigation. Please allow us to escort you to a private lounge." Malcolm studied the hand, but did not take it immediately. He looked Parker in the eye, weighing the sincerity behind the polished words. The cameras clicked furiously, recording even this hesitation. Finally, Malcolm spoke. His voice was calm, even, but it carried through the chaos like steel. "Apologies are words. Dignity is action. I'll be watching for action." He did not shake Parker's hand. Instead, he adjusted the strap of his briefcase and continued walking. Ortiz at his side. The decision reverberated instantly. Reporters gasped. Pens scribbled. Cameras zoomed. In that refusal, Malcolm had said more than a speech could. In the lounge, quiet replaced the storm. The glass walls muted the frenzy outside, though reporters still clustered against them like moths to light. Malcolm sank into a chair, his hands finally trembling now that the pressure eased. Ortiz stood nearby, arms folded. "You did well out there. You kept your composure." Malcolm let out a humorless laugh. "On the outside, maybe inside, I was fighting myself every second." Eleanor, who had been escorted in with them, lowered herself into a seat opposite him. Her cane rested across her knees. "That's the fight we all live, son. But you carried it with dignity. Don't forget that." Malcolm rubbed his temple, exhaustion settling in. He could already imagine the boardroom calls waiting, the headlines spinning, the hashtags multiplying. His company, his family, his name all tangled now with this moment. He whispered, almost to himself, "I just wanted to fly." Eleanor leaned forward, her gaze fierce despite her years. "And because you didn't move, maybe thousands more will be able to fly tomorrow with a little more dignity. Don't ever underestimate the ripple of one choice." Ortiz's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, then looked to Malcolm. "Dr. Wright, the Secretary of Transportation's office has already reached out. They want a briefing. They want your perspective." Malcolm's head lifted slowly. He had expected outrage, maybe statements, but not this. The immediacy of it struck him. This was no longer just a passenger's humiliation. It had become a national question. His chest tightened with the weight of it. A voice in him whispered, "This is bigger than you." He thought again of Jasmine at Harvard, watching her father become a headline. What would she see? A man humiliated or a man who refused to move? Perhaps both. Perhaps that was the truth, that strength was not the absence of pain, but the refusal to let pain define the ending. When he finally rose, his movements were deliberate. He walked to the lounge window, gazing out at the swarm of cameras and microphones. Their flashes still pierced through the glass, relentless. He took a deep breath and whispered, "Not for them, not even for the world, but for himself. If my seat becomes a platform, then let it carry more than me." The night outside glimmered with city lights, each one a reminder of the millions who might soon hear his name. He did not yet know the full scope of what was coming: the hearings, the reforms, the reckonings, but he felt it begin. Right there in the lounge of an airport he hadn't planned to linger in. He turned back to Eleanor and Ortiz. His voice was quiet, but resolved. "Tomorrow, I'll speak." The lounge door opened, and the noise outside surged in for a moment before being pressed back by glass and distance. A representative in a navy blazer stepped forward, his earpiece buzzing with updates. "Dr. Wright," he said cautiously. "The press is waiting. You don't have to address them tonight. But if you choose to, they'll listen." Malcolm sat still for a long moment. His hands rested on the arms of the leather chair, his fingers tapping an almost imperceptible rhythm. He thought of silence, how tempting it was to withdraw, to let statements be issued by executives, to slip away into the quiet of a car waiting outside. But silence, he knew, would not stay empty. It would be filled by others, by spin, by rumor, by those eager to twist the story to fit their own narratives. If his voice was absent, someone else would write the ending. Eleanor Grant's voice, soft yet resolute, broke his hesitation. "Say what needs saying. Son, the world doesn't often pause to listen, but tonight it will," Ortiz added quietly. "And if you speak, you won't be speaking just for yourself." Malcolm rose slowly. His body felt heavy, but his steps carried a kind of inevitability. He adjusted his jacket, smoothed the papers in his briefcase, not because he needed them, but because the gesture steadied him. When he finally stepped through the doors into the glare of cameras, the noise hit like a wave. Shouts of his name, flashes exploding, microphones thrust forward. His heart pounded, but his face remained calm, his stride measured. He stopped at the podium hastily assembled by the airline, its logo stamped across the front. The COO, James Parker, hovered nearby, his expression tense, hoping for control but knowing control was long gone. Malcolm set the briefcase down gently, then lifted his gaze to the crowd. For a moment, he said nothing. The silence stretched, the tension building until even the reporters leaned in, waiting. Finally, he spoke. His voice was low, but carried, each word deliberate. "My name is Dr. Malcolm Wright. Tonight, I sat in seat 2A on Flight 227, a seat I purchased, a seat I had every right to occupy, and yet I was told I did not belong." The flashes intensified. Reporters scribbled furiously. Malcolm's eyes swept the crowd. This is not about one man or one pilot. It is about the deeper truth we all know but too often ignore. Dignity should not depend on the color of your skin, the wealth in your pocket, or the title before your name. Dignity is not earned. It is inherent. And yet, too often, it is denied. He paused, letting the words settle. The hush was palpable now. Even the clicking of cameras slowed. "I am not here tonight to demand revenge. I am not here to humiliate anyone. I am here because silence allows injustice to repeat itself. And I cannot, will not, be silent." His voice deepened, his cadence finding rhythm. "I am the son of a postal worker and a nurse's aide from Atlanta. I built a company from nothing but a garage and a dream. And yet, with all of that, I still face the same question too many of us face. Do you belong here?" Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some nodded. Others looked down at their notes, visibly moved. Malcolm's hand tightened slightly on the podium. "Yes, I belong here. And so does every person who has ever been doubted, dismissed, or demeaned because of prejudice. Tonight was not just my fight. It was a mirror. And I ask you all, what do you see in that mirror?" For a moment, the only sound was the faint buzz of the microphones. Eleanor, standing just behind the crowd, straightened her shoulders, pride shimmering in her tired eyes. Ortiz, arms crossed, nodded slowly, as if confirming that Malcolm's calm resolve was the truest form of strength. Malcolm took a breath, his tone softening. "I have a daughter. She's 19. Tonight she will see her father not as a CEO or an engineer, but as a man who refused to move. I hope she sees not the humiliation, but the resolve. I hope she remembers that dignity is never negotiable. A reporter called out, breaking the hush. Dr. Wright, do you plan to sue the airline? Malcolm's gaze met the reporter's, unwavering. This is not about lawsuits. This is about leadership. The airline must decide whether to lead with accountability or hide behind apologies. My part tonight is simple: to tell the truth of what happened. Another voice rose. Do you forgive Captain Shaw? Malcolm paused, considering. His answer came steady, measured. Forgiveness is not mine to grant or deny in public, but accountability that is non-negotiable. Without accountability, forgiveness is empty. The words struck hard. Heads nodded in the crowd, pens scrawled furiously, and cameras leaned closer. Finally, Malcolm stepped back slightly from the podium. I will speak more in the days ahead. Tonight, I ask you to remember one thing: respect should never be first class or economy. It belongs to all of us. The phrase landed like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward. Reporters shouted more questions, but Malcolm closed his briefcase calmly, gave a slight nod, and stepped away. The moment was done, but the echo of it was only beginning. As security escorted him through the throng, Eleanor caught his arm, her voice barely above a whisper. You spoke the truth, son. That's all the world ever needed from you. Malcolm gave her a small, tired smile. Now let's see if they're ready to hear it. The night after the press conference did not fall into silence. It erupted. By midnight, Malcolm's words were everywhere. Cable news replayed the clip of him standing calm and unshaken, his line echoing on every channel. Respect should never be first class or economy. It belongs to all of us. Anchors debated, commentators dissected, and hashtags multiplied like wildfire. On Twitter, row seat 2A trended worldwide. Posts poured in from activists, from celebrities, from ordinary travelers sharing their own stories of humiliation in airports and planes. Dr. Wright spoke for me tonight, one user wrote, racking up 500,000 likes. Another posted, I was told to step aside at boarding once because they didn't believe my ticket. Tonight, someone with power showed the world it still happens. YouTube lit up with reaction videos. Clips of the confrontation filmed by passengers were already uploaded, some edited into montages with swelling music. TikTok had split-screen edits, Malcolm on one side, people on the other reacting with tears, fists clenched, nodding fiercely. In living rooms across the country, families sat together and argued about what the incident meant. For some, it confirmed what they already knew: bias that lingered like a shadow in daily life. For others, it was a first uncomfortable glimpse. In Atlanta, Malcolm's daughter Jasmine watched the coverage with her college roommates. Her phone buzzed with messages. Your dad is everywhere. She saw the clip of him mentioning her during the speech and felt tears sting her eyes. He hadn't said her name, but she knew. He was telling the world that her dignity mattered. 2. By tuo mum. The airline CEO, Robert Gaines, called an emergency board meeting. His voice was tight, his shoulders slumped. This is beyond damage control. He admitted, this is structural. Some board members muttered about firing Captain Shaw immediately. Others argued for delay. The debate was heated, but one thing was undeniable. Public trust was slipping through their fingers like sand. Meanwhile, Captain Shaw himself sat in his quiet home in Dallas, blinds drawn, TV muted. He had tried to log into his email earlier, but the airline had already suspended his account. His phone buzzed relentlessly. Reporters, friends, even family members wanting to know what happened. Shaw stared at the wall, replaying the night over and over. For the first time in years, his confidence cracked. At dawn, in Los Angeles, the first print editions hit the stands. The Los Angeles Times headline read, "CEO denied boarding. A crisis in the skies." The Washington Post followed with Wright's stand echoes across America. The New York Times wrote, "When Seat 2A became a symbol, political figures weighed in within hours." A congresswoman from New York tweeted, "Dr. Wright's courage reminds us why oversight matters. Airlines must be held accountable." Civil rights organizations announced they would demand congressional hearings. The NAACP scheduled a press conference for the following afternoon. Malcolm's phone, left on silent, filled with unread messages. Executives from other companies reached out privately, offering support. A senator from Georgia left a voicemail. His pastor called, praying for strength. Even rivals in business circles admitted, sometimes grudgingly, that he had handled himself with unusual grace. In his hotel room, Malcolm sat at the small desk, the blinds half open, watching dawn paint the horizon in muted pink and gold. His eyes were tired, but his mind refused rest. Eleanor Grant's words echoed in his ears. "Say what needs saying. Son." Now the world was asking for more. Ortiz knocked lightly and stepped in, carrying a tray of coffee. "You won't have a quiet day," he said, "but you can choose how it begins." Malcolm gave a faint smile. "Coffee's a good start." As they sipped, Ortiz leaned against the window. "You know this isn't just your fight anymore, right? It's bigger. You've become a symbol." Malcolm's gaze dropped to his hands. He thought of the young men and women watching online, of his daughter, of strangers writing messages like prayers. He had wanted to remain just a man, a father, a leader of a company. But symbols were not chosen. They were thrust upon people. "Symbols don't get to rest," Malcolm murmured. "True," Ortiz said, "but they can choose what direction they point in." Later that morning, when Malcolm finally turned his phone back on, the first call he returned was to Jasmine. Her voice shook with emotion. "Daddy, I saw everything. I'm proud of you." His throat tightened. "You okay?" "I'm fine," she said, then paused. I don't want you to carry this alone." Malcolm closed his eyes, picturing her face as a little girl, then as the woman she was becoming. "I'm not alone. Baby, I've got you. I've got people standing up. That's enough." By mid-morning, the hotel lobby was a circus. Reporters camped outside. Protesters gathered with signs, and supporters cheered Malcolm's name. Some carried posters with his words printed in bold, "Respect belongs to all of us." Others held up their own boarding passes, waving them like symbols of defiance. Inside, Malcolm prepared for a second statement, one that would not just recount events but begin to outline change. He drafted carefully, pen scratching across paper. His words would need to balance outrage with vision, anger with hope. Mrs. Eleanor Grant sat nearby, her cane leaning against the arm of a chair. "Don't just tell them what's broken," she said gently. "Tell them what it could look like if it were whole." Malcolm nodded slowly. "That's the harder part." "Maybe," Eleanor said, "but it's the part people will remember." Outside, the chants grew louder. Media vans multiplied. Cable news anchors spoke live from the curb, their breath fogging in the cool morning air. By noon, it was undeniable. A firestorm was raging not just around one man, but around an industry, a culture, a country forced once again to look in the mirror. And in the middle of it all, Malcolm Wright stood calm, preparing to guide the storm rather than be consumed by it. By the following week, the storm had reshaped itself into something steadier, something larger. It was no longer just headlines or hashtags. It was policy meetings, congressional calls, and boardroom reckonings. Dr. Malcolm Wright stood at a mahogany podium in Washington, D.C., this time in front of lawmakers, airline executives, and activists. Cameras still whirred, pens still scratched. But the tone in the room was different. Not frenzy, purpose. Malcolm spoke without notes. What happened to me on Flight 227 is not an isolated event. It is part of a pattern. And patterns, when ignored, harden into systems. My question to you all is simple. Will we allow systems of exclusion to remain hidden, or will we confront them openly? His words carried beyond the chamber. Civil rights leaders applauded. Lawmakers leaned forward. Airline representatives shifted uncomfortably. Yet in the silence between his sentences, there was acknowledgement. Denial was no longer possible. The hearings led to new oversight measures, independent bias audits for all major airlines, federal reporting channels for discrimination complaints, and required annual training that went beyond scripted videos, real workshops led by experts, evaluated by passengers themselves. But policy was only half the story. The other half was personal. In Atlanta, Jasmine walked across her campus, hearing strangers whisper her name. Some came up to her directly, saying, "Your dad gave me courage." She smiled, but inside she wrestled with the weight. Pride mingled with unease because every time someone mentioned her father, she remembered the moment he had been told he didn't belong. Pride and pain, inseparable. When she called him late one evening, her voice cracked. "Dad, do you ever wish it hadn't happened? That none of this attention was on us?" Malcolm sat in his quiet office, the city lights glowing through the window. He considered carefully. Sometimes, yes, I wish I'd just boarded quietly, flown, and come home. But then I remember silence doesn't protect us. Jasmine, it just delays the reckoning. And if carrying this helps the next person walk freer, then it's worth it. She didn't answer immediately. Then she whispered, "I believe you." Malcolm closed his eyes, grateful for her trust, for the chance to turn pain into something that might outlast both of them. Eleanor Grant, meanwhile, returned to her small home in Pasadena. She had lived through marches in the 1960s, through fire hoses and fear. Watching Malcolm stand tall reminded her of those days, but also showed her something new: that courage could wear a tailored suit and speak in the calm cadence of a CEO, and still cut just as deep. In her journal, she wrote, "The struggle changes clothes, but it is the same struggle, and so must be the courage." Captain Douglas Shaw faced a harsher reckoning, stripped of his position, investigated for prior complaints. He sat through hours of testimony. The pride that had once filled his chest like armor now felt like lead. Reporters hounded him. His neighbors turned cold. And in his silence, for the first time, he began to see the faces of those he had dismissed over the years. Regret was late in coming, but it was real. Samuel Ortiz, the Air Marshal, returned to duty quietly. Yet among his peers, his name carried new weight. They called him the one who stood up. In briefings, younger marshals asked about that night. Ortiz would only shrug and say, "I did my job." The real courage was his, but in his private reflections, he carried pride that he had chosen accountability when the moment demanded it. Months passed. Outrage cooled, but the reforms remained. Airlines released public audits, some embarrassing, some encouraging. Lawsuits were filed, settlements reached, new training rolled out. Skeptics called it cosmetic, but passengers noticed changes: more respectful interactions, clearer complaint channels, fewer humiliations brushed aside. The shift was not perfect, but it was real. For Malcolm, the legacy took shape in the form of a foundation. Standing before a room of donors and activists, he announced the launch of the Sky Justice Foundation. "This is not about me," he said firmly. "It is about the countless others whose stories never reached a microphone. We will fund legal support, track data, and ensure dignity is not a privilege, but a baseline." Applause thundered, cameras flashed, but Malcolm's eyes found Jasmine's in the crowd, and in her smile, he saw not just support, but continuity, the assurance that his fight would not end with him. The foundation grew quickly, partnering with universities, civil rights groups, and even progressive airline leaders who wanted to be part of the change. Annual reports tracked progress, not just failures. Young activists joined, energized by the idea that one man's refusal to move had sparked an entire movement. 1 year after the incident, a commemorative forum was held at LAX. Reporters returned, though fewer now, their tone less frantic, more reflective. Passengers and crew members who had been on Flight 220 came to share their perspectives. Eleanor spoke softly about dignity. Ortiz recalled the moment he said, "Step aside, Captain." Jasmine, her voice stronger than ever, told the crowd, "My father showed me that hope is not passive. It stands, it resists, and it heals." Finally, Malcolm stepped up to the microphone. The crowd quieted. He looked older, perhaps a little more weary, but his presence was steady, commanding. "On that night, I thought the story would be about humiliation. I thought it would end with pain. But you all passengers, allies, voices across this country turned it into something else. You turned it into a reminder that justice is not an abstract dream. It is built moment by moment, choice by choice. Tonight, I want to thank you. Not for standing for me, but for standing with me." The crowd rose in applause. Eleanor wiped a tear. Ortiz clasped his hands, his eyes moist. Jasmine beamed with quiet pride. And as Malcolm stepped away from the microphone, he felt something rare, something he had almost forgotten in the chaos of the past year: hope. Not the fragile hope of wishing, but the grounded hope of building. For he knew the work was unfinished. Prejudice did not vanish with one speech, one policy, or one foundation. But it could be challenged, it could be weakened, and it could be met with dignity that refused to bend. And that, he thought, was enough to begin again. The story of Dr. Malcolm Wright reminds us that dignity is never optional. It is the birthright of every human being. Too often in life, people are judged not by their character, but by appearances, wealth, or status. But when injustice confronts us, silence only allows it to grow stronger. Dr. Wright's choice to stand firm, calmly but decisively, teaches us a lesson we can all carry into our own lives. Courage does not always roar. Sometimes, courage is steady, quiet, and rooted in the conviction that we matter. For older generations, this story echoes memories of past struggles when people stood up against discrimination in buses, schools, or workplaces. It is a reminder that progress often comes from ordinary moments of resolve. We all face times when we must decide whether to stay silent or speak truth with grace. The lesson is clear: respect should never be first class or economy. It should be for everyone. In our daily lives with neighbors, colleagues, strangers, we have the power to affirm dignity with simple acts of fairness and empathy. And in doing so, we leave behind a legacy of hope for those who follow. Thank you so much for watching and sharing this journey with us. Stories like this remind us how powerful dignity and compassion can be when we choose them. If this story moved you, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more voices, more hope, and more truth to the world.